Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of our login and monitoring journey. In the first video, I showed you how to deploy the tools. We had a walkthrough of all of the features. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create dashboards. But before that, I'm going to show you how to configure them so that they can talk to each other, how we can scrape metrics, and ultimately, by the end of this video, we'll have some dashboards for common things like Docker, CrowdSec, and Sophos. So let's go ahead and get right into building out our Docker dashboard. Now, the first thing we need to do is to connect our services together. If you cast your mind back to the first video, we set up Telegraph to have access to the Docker SOC so it can pull the metrics that it needs, but it's got nowhere to save them. So this is where we need to go back into the Telegraph conf and add an output. Now thankfully, that's really simple. Head back into where you've got your telegraph.conf file, open that file up, and then at the bottom, you're going to need to add this here. So outputs.influxdb_version2, we're using version 2. And we're going to need to copy in all of these details. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will see that we need a token because we're going to store this in Influx. As I mentioned in the first video, we need to go and create that token. Before we do that, let's just have a quick look here. Organization is the way that InfluxDB splits out its bit like tables, and then within that you can have different buckets. So previously we've done things in PostgreSQL, and we've set things like different databases within the same container. In this, we basically set up an organization, so I've just called it home, and within that I've created a Homelab bucket. Now you could create any name you want to, just remember what they are. And you might even want to split these data sets out. So I've got my Homelab, which will look at Docker. I could have called this Docker. I could then create another bucket called CrowdSec, etc. You get the picture. So let's head now into the Influx dashboard, and we need to create this token that we're going to paste into this file. So when you've logged into Influx, you're going to want to hit up to the buckets section in the top left, and you're going to want to create your bucket. In this context, I've set Homelab. That's the one I'm going to specify. This is where it's going to store all of my Docker container data. Once you've created this bucket, go back to the arrow and we want to click API tokens. When you create an API token by clicking in the top right, generate API token, you're going to need to give it a name. Now, I'm giving it an all access token here, but you could create custom API tokens if you just wanted to use a specific bucket or just give it specific permissions. I do recommend you go and do that, so have a look at what you need and just configure that. Once you've clicked on the prompt, give it a name, so I'll call this one Homelab 2 just for example, and hit save. You'll see here it creates a new token. Now, as the message says, make sure you copy this because once you click off here, you can't get it back. So copy and paste this. We'll head back now into our Telegraph conf and we'll paste that value over this one here. Now, that's basically like a password, the API token. So now when you restart and you've got to do a Docker restart for Telegraph, it should now have access to Influx. That means it now is able to scrape the data from Docker and import it into the database. Once you've restarted your container, you can now go back to your buckets, click on your Homelab, and hopefully you should start to see some of this data here populated. Now, it might take a few minutes to refresh depending on what you've set your global variables to be, but I believe it does an initial scrape when you start the container. So there should be some stuff there. And as I showed in the last one, you can query all of this and get some nice values out of it. But let's head back now into Grafana, and we want to be able to connect Grafana to our Influx database now that it has some data. So head back into Grafana now, and then click on menu, and then click connections, click data sources, and then we want to click a new one. So we can leave the default name as InfluxDB. The important bit here, because we're using version 2, is to change the Influx query language to Flux, which I mentioned earlier. The fundamental change here is it requires a token. So that's exactly the same process as we just did for generating the token for Influx. So here we've got the URL populated already. It's http influxdb:8086. We can obviously use influxdb because Docker has its own internal DNS. So it knows that that container is called influxdb because that's what we called it. So once you've got that, we can do basic auth. Put in your password for your web GUI. I've just used admin here. And the organization, if you remember from the Telegraph conf, we need to copy that over. So let's have a quick reminder of what that is. In my example, my organization is called Home. So I can copy and paste Home into the organization. Now the token, you could use the same token as you use for Influx, I believe, but I'm going to head back into Influx and I'm going to create a new token. And I'm going to call this one Grafana. Once that's created, I'm going to copy it. Do note that when I clicked copy to clipboard in previous examples, it never actually copied it to the clipboard and I just got blank stuff or either the thing that I last copied. So do make sure you actually copy it, right click if you're not having the same success. And then back into our InfluxDB in Grafana, we can now paste that token in here. The default bucket, if you remember in my config, I've put Homelab. So again, I'm going to copy Homelab. I'm going to put that into my default bucket. And with any luck, I should be able to save and test this and get a green message. Here goes. There we go. Data source is working. 3 buckets were added. So if I now go back to data sources, you can see here that I've got InfluxDB. And I'll show you how to do Prometheus in a little bit. Now that we've got InfluxDB connected to Grafana, we're in a really good position to be able to build out our first dashboard. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is using the Flux query language. I could do a whole host of videos on that, but I'm not going to. So the way I recommend to do this is to go to the Grafana website and actually look at their dashboards that are publicly available. So these are people that have created dashboards already and made those publicly available on the website. So I've simply gone on here and clicked Docker, and it's pulled up a load of dashboards that have been created. Now, I've sorted this by last updated because that's typically important because different modules, different platforms become outdated over time. So you really want one that's being maintained. The key thing here is to look at when you click on them, check the dependencies. So those should be called out here. So this is using Prometheus. So if you were scraping your Telegraph into Prometheus, this would be a good bet. But we're putting it into InfluxDB. So I found another one earlier that I'm going to use, and this is really good because it gives us a quick and easy dashboard, and then we can actually reverse engineer that dashboard to have a look at some of the query languages. And that's what I recommend that you do if you're just getting started. If you want to get into creating really bespoke dashboards, you're going to need to learn how to do the query language. But for someone who's like me, is a visual learner, doing it this way is really helpful. So heading back into Grafana, we want to go to Home, we want to click Dashboards, and on the right hand side we want to click a New. And instead of doing, say, a blank dashboard, which would just be done by clicking New Dashboard, where you'd need to know all of the queries, we can now click Import. And then if you click on the grafana.com dashboard URL, you can either put in the URL that you were on just a moment ago, or you can specify the ID that was on that page. So I found a really good one, which was 17,020. And if I click Load, you can see it's pulled all that in. Now, we can't just click import because we need to tell it which database. Now, if you haven't completed the steps previously, where we connected Grafana to Influx, you won't have this option available. So make sure that if you've not got this available, you go back and do that step. So let's select this database and then let's click import. Now, perfect, that seems to have worked. It says no data, but that's because in the top here, it's defaulted to the monitoring bucket. Now, these are 2 buckets that Influx created when we spun it up, and you know that we specified the Homelab one earlier. So if I click on this one, magic, there's all the data that's been scraped by Telegraph from Docker and stored in Influx. And now you can click on any of the containers that you're running and you'll see the statistics for that container. You can obviously go and edit this and change it so that it does the averages across them all. You could go and tick all of these and you would have them all in handy little dashboards and little graphs, etc. And if you want to, you can obviously dive into here. You can click edit and then you're going to see all of the query that makes this up. So if you wanted to change, for example, one of these data sets, you could go in here and have a look. Now what's really handy is you can see the structure here. So here we're selecting a bucket, we're collecting the time range stamp, we want the measurement, and then we're doing the field. And these are equal to values. And we can actually look at that if we go back into Influx. And if we go to our buckets, and if we click in Homelab, you can see all of those here. So if we look in Grafana, we've got a measurement called Docker. So we can see that here. And then we've got in here a field, which is number CPUs. And then here you can see a field called number of CPUs. And what it's doing is just reading the value from here. So if you're a bit concerned about, well, what are those field names? Because Influx has a nice handy UI, you can actually just go in here and see all of those names and then help to build out your dashboard by adding them in here. So now that you've got the bare bones of what you want to monitor in Docker, you could add more statistics in here if you wanted to and scrape the whole API. I'm really keen to see what you guys build, and maybe there's another one on there that's a better dashboard that I'm using. It'd be great if you guys could build something and then give back to the community. Let me know in the comments what you come up with, and it would be great to see some of those in my Discord channel. So now we have the Docker dashboard up and running. Let's move on to getting our CrowdSec stats dashboarded. Now, it follows a similar process as before. There's a few steps before we get into dashboarding mode, and chiefly that's going to be using Prometheus. Now, you might be thinking, well, James, Telegraph does scraping for us. Well, it does, and so does Prometheus. And I could have used Telegraph to do this, but I wanted to show you how it's done within Prometheus so that we can learn more tools, because some things will have different dependencies and sometimes it's just not the right tool for the job. So to get this working in Prometheus, it's pretty simple. We head to the prometheus.yml config file, open that up, and then you'll see here at the bottom, we just create this area. Now, everything you want to scrape with Prometheus will have a section like this. And under this scrape configs, you would just copy this part here, you would paste it below, and that would be another scrape job. You'd give it a new name, a new target, etc. And there's a whole host of other configurations that you could put in here to make it tailor fit for whatever it is you're monitoring. In this instance, I'm just doing CrowdSec. So I've given it CrowdSec my machine, and I've taken this config from the official website. And it's really straightforward. We just simply need to give it a target. So in this instance, the target is my CrowdSec instance. It's running on this virtual machine, and it's port 6060, which by default won't be open, so we need to go and change that now. But once you do open it, you'll even be able to visit this in a web browser and you'll see all of the metrics. So let's go back to our Docker Compose for CrowdSec. Let's add port 6060 so it's exposed, redeploy that container, and then we're good to go. So save this in the prometheus.yaml, redeploy Prometheus, and let's now head over to CrowdSec. So back in our CrowdSec Docker Compose, you simply need to add ports and then port 6060, 6060. Once you've added that, save it and redeploy the container. Make sure you redeploy, not restart. You might need to do --force recreate, or you could simply delete the container and recreate it, whatever you prefer. Once you've done that, and we can validate that the port's open within Portainer, we go to that website, make sure you put /metrics on the end, and fingers crossed, we see all of the metrics now from CrowdSec. And Prometheus will be polling this on the specified time frame within the config file. So now that we've done this, we should have Prometheus scraping CrowdSec and storing it within its database. So just like in the previous example, we're now in the position where we can create the dashboard. But before that, you guessed it, we've got to connect Grafana to Prometheus. Let's do that now. To do that, we head back into the Connections tab within Grafana. And this time, instead of clicking an Influx data source, we want a Prometheus. And we don't need to do anything fancy here. We haven't actually got any authentication in the way. We simply need to put in HTTP Prometheus and then port 9090. That's what it's running on. And we need to click Save and Test. Hopefully it's green and we're up and running. One thing you might want to do just before this is go to that URL. Well, not quite that URL. Remember, that's an internal DNS name. within Docker itself, we'd want to go to the IP, and then we'd want to go to port 9090. So if I go to that on my machine, you can see that I'm in Prometheus, and hopefully now if we click on status and targets, remember in our config we specified a target here. So if this is working correctly, that target should be here, and voila, it is, and it's got the name of my machine CrowdSec, which is what we specified along with the IP address. So excellent, that looks like it's working. So now back into here, if we click save and test, that should be good. If it's not, just double check that you've got everything right and you've followed these steps in order. And now we're going to head back to Grafana, the dashboarding section, and we're going to add a new dashboard. Now, thankfully, CrowdSec have made these available and it's super easy. Let's just have a quick look at that now. So over on CrowdSec's GitHub, I'm going to go for dashboard version 5, that's the latest version, and we're running all the latest versions of Grafana and our databases. So in dashboard 5, I don't think these have actually been uploaded onto the Grafana website, so unfortunately we don't have the handy ID. Instead, you can click on one of these, you can simply copy it using the raw, go back into Grafana, head to the dashboard section, click a new and import again, but instead of putting the ID in here this time, we simply paste as plain text, and you can see it all here. And I've done this for all 4 of the available examples here. So once you've added all 4, you simply click load here. You should be able to go back to your dashboards and you should see them all here. So now, for example, if I go to my CrowdSec overview, I can click on that and I can see all of the stats on my CrowdSec. So for instance, I can see there's been 24,000, almost 25,000 decisions in the last 24 hours. And again, you can change this to whatever time frame you want. And because this is just on my Docker test, which I use for these videos, there hasn't been a whole lot of stuff going on. So I expect when you put this onto your production CrowdSec, it should look a lot more interesting. And this will be really useful because it's going to show you what decisions were made against which CVE, and can't go into that too much, but these are basically definitions for common cyber threats. So you'll be able to go and research what one of these is, and then hopefully find out, well, why am I getting hit with a load of these? Is this something I need to be worried about? Is it something I'm vulnerable to? More often than not, you're not. These are bots just doing stuff on old machines and looking for old vulnerabilities. You should be covered if you followed a lot of the steps within my Homelab journey. Things like having CrowdSec itself, plus Sophos XG, and a whole host of other things. So once you've set up all of those dashboards, feel free to go and have a look again in the query language. You could even combine these if you wanted to. You could even consolidate some of these and tweak them into their own single dashboard. And now you could even blend this with your Docker. So you could actually have a single pane of glass where you put all the stats that you want, and they don't even have to be from the same database. You could connect them to anything you want. So we know that we've got Influx, we know that we've got Prometheus. You could take a metric from the Influx dashboard and put it against something from Prometheus. As long as the times match up, you're good to go. Also, as I promised, we can get our stats from our Sophos XG. If you've been following my videos, you'll know how to go and set that up, and I've got more on the way. But anyway, let's get back to dashboarding. So to configure getting metrics from Sophos XG, there's a few things that we need to do first. Firstly, we need to enable SNMP within Sophos XG. That's the simple network messaging protocol. To do that, you need to head into your firewall. You need to go to administration on the left-hand panel. Then you need to click on SNMP. Here you need to create a name. In this instance, I've just called it Sophos XG. This is what's commonly referred to as the community. So if you see that in the SNMP language, the community is the name here. So make sure you remember that. Give it a location. I've just said it's in my Homelab and the contact person is home. Those aren't important for what we're doing today. And the key bit is down at the bottom. You need to add in a user. So this is somebody who's able to query your firewall from an IP address. So it's a bit like creating a firewall rule. So here I've put my Docker host and I've called it Sophos XG, which is the same as the name up here, and I've given it an IP address. Now what that means is this IP address, which is my Docker host, can query my firewall to get this data. Now, what does that look like? Well, if I fire up my terminal, I'll show you a little example here. If I run this command, which is snmp walk, you'll see it spits out all of the data that my firewall can give you. Now, this isn't very user-friendly, and don't worry about that, we can solve it. But this just goes to show that it's working from the host that I've selected, so we're good to continue. So now that we've got the firewall set up, there's a few more steps. We need to download what's called a MIBS file. Now, the MIBS file, if we go to our Docker host, I have this already here. The MIBS file is downloaded from the Sophos XG website, and I've put this into the /MIBS folder within the bind mount. If you open this up, it basically is a format for all of that data we just saw. So where I ran it in the command line and it just spat out a load of stuff, this helps to sort of structure that data into meaningful things. So you'll see that it will have a reference and then it will actually have a name assigned to it. So what we need to do is add this to our MIBS folder, which is here. We need to go back into our Docker Compose file and make sure that that's referenced. So if you've been following my example, you should already have that. So let's just go and double check. Going into the Docker Compose file, if I scroll down to where Telegraph is, you'll see that it's here. So as long as you have that, and as long as you've copied the MIBS file into that folder I just showed, it should pick it up. And when you log into your Portainer, and if you go into the Telegraph logs, you should see something here where it will say loaded inputs from Docker snmp. That's the MIBS file. So with the MIBS file added, there's one more thing we need to do, and that's to go back into the Telegraph conf file, and we need to basically put a ton of inputs like we did previously that are mapped to those MIBS values. I'll show you what that means. So I've gone back to my telegraph.conf file and I've pasted all of these inputs into it. So these OIDs reference the values in the MIBS file. So you'll see that a device name is actually an OID of this number here. The device firewall version is this one here, and so on. There's about 100 of them. I'll add all of these files to my GitHub so you can just copy and paste them. Don't worry too much about that. The key bit is here, where we specify the inputs.snmp. So all you need to do here is specify the IP address of your firewall and the community that it's on. Remember, in my case, that was Sophos XG. It's the name that we specified for SNMP. So now that we've got this in the telegraph.conf, we've added the MIBS file to the bind mount. We should save this and we should redeploy Telegraph. And I've already done that in the background. And as you can see, it picked up here, loaded inputs, Docker, SNMP. Perfect. So from the logs, just ignore these here, it's where it wasn't working earlier. It's now working. So if I now head back into Influx, you'll see that there's the Docker from previously, but because I've still specified the output as my Influx database, I now have SNMP, and this is the SNMP that's coming from my firewall. So if I simply click that, we'll get all the fields from this measurement, and this is Flux language. And then you'll see here things like the device name. So I click the device name and it's the device name for that IP. Remember, you could have multiple firewalls and you want to query them all. If I click that, I then get this hash. And then when I actually find out what the data is, because there's an array value here, I can actually click submit here on the right and I get the value, which is firewall.jimsgarage.co.uk, which is right. So this all looks like it's working and we've validated it with Influx. And the really cool thing here is when we submit this, we can actually look at the script editor and we can cheat. It's going to give us the Flux query language we need to get this up and running in Grafana, because unfortunately there doesn't seem to be an up-to-date dashboard that we can simply pinch. We need to create our own. Now that's not too difficult because again, we've got the handy interface here in Influx. We can pick all the stats we want and then just copy and paste the code. So if we copy this code here, right click, copy, we can head into Grafana, and I've just created a new dashboard here, and I've created a new stat panel. That's all it is. It's of type stat, so you can see it at the top. You wouldn't want to create a graph because it's a text file, and I've simply pasted that in here. And on the right, the important bit here is just to choose the last and to choose the field, the device name. And there we go, it's pulled out the name. So I could do this for anything. I could pull all of the data from my network traffic and all of that good stuff. I'm not going to do that because I want you to go away and do that and share your pictures with me in my Discord. So a huge thank you for sticking with me on this one. It took me ages to get all of this working, and I hope that I've now provided you with all of these enterprise tools in a really handy, convenient script, and I've given you a brief overview of how you can go and configure these and start dashboarding. Now, I'm really keen to see what you guys come up with, because I think it's a great opportunity as well to give back to the community and share your dashboards. So thanks again for watching. If you've liked this video, please like, subscribe, and add a comment, and I'll see you soon. Take care, everybody.